So let's talk about the 2001 awards, which had to be moved because the tragedy of 9/11 occurred. Can you talk about the impact on you and the awards department, and also what was the intended tone of that show, and what were some of the challenges you had with putting that together?
First of all, we were able to get the creative arts resolved, so that was presented. So the only other thing that we were then now dealing with was the telecast. And with 9/11, the telecast was off the books and we were going to put it someplace else. Well, unfortunately, the place that we put it was the day that the Bush administration decided to invade Afghanistan. I believe it was October 7th, if I'm correct. We had the salads on the tables. We had the water in the glasses. We had everything ready to go. And the show, of course, was going to start at 5. And I think that it was about 2 that afternoon that the rumbling started about whether or not we should go forward with the show. This was a CBS year, and Leslie Moonves was out on the golf course, and he was called, and he came over to the Shrine, which is where we were having it at that particular time. Our chair was discussing it with Les. Our president at that time, Jim Chavin, was discussing it with him, and the feeling was that and this was totally wrong. The feeling was that this was going to disrupt and go through the entire rest of the Sunday programming, Sunday network programming, that this was the first domino to fall, if you will, in a whole series of dominoes. No domino fell except for the Emmy Awards. Programming that came on after 6 or 7 or whatever, 7 o'clock on Sunday with 60 Minutes, that programming did not change one bit. The only thing that changed was that the Emmys were pulled. We never should have done it. We should have stuck to the schedule, and we should have gone forward in a very sober and very considerate and I think appropriately celebratory for what we were doing. That this is the medium, the most powerful medium in the history of the world, and we are honoring it tonight, and we're doing it in a way that in no way is going to be disrespectful to the world situation and the war that has now begun. There was a way that could be done. Unfortunately, we didn't, and probably the saddest person was Don Mischer, who was in my trailer at that time, and he had another obligation to do another show later on, and so he was unable to stay with it, and he was trying to explain how there were elements that were in the show that hopefully they could still use as we went forward. Okay, so that was that. We now decide, and there was also a parallel event taking place in New York. I think it was at the Ed Sullivan Theater or someplace back there, and that went to hell. So then we reschedule again. Ellen, faithful to the core, said, okay, I'll come back again. And that's when she came out with the famous dress. It was some sort of a duck or something that she was wearing. And is it okay to wear a goose after Labor Day, or whatever her joke was? And, of course, she had the greatest line of the evening, which is, this ought to really piss off the Taliban. A gay woman talking in front of a room full of Jews. That brought down the house, and that set the tone for the rest of the evening. And we got through, and Gary Smith was the producer that year, and the surprise at the end was that Barbara Streisand came out and sang that very moving as we walked through the storm and all of that. And you kind of look back on it and said, well, maybe that was a little bit much, but at that stage of the game, nobody knew what was going to go on, and nobody knew anything, and it was a horribly emotionally difficult time for this country. And so it was, 2 strikes and you hit a homer. So it was nice. Usually when you have a 0-2 count, you don't come through with a good swat at the end, but we did. So we got through it. I'm glad. It was really dreadful. This year, I have to tell you, I was very anxious on Emmy Day because Trump had been making all kinds of noise about Iran and he was going to get these guys. And I thought, I told Julie, I said, if we go through this again with an invasion of a Middle Eastern country, I hope, and it was CBS again. No, it's Fox this year. And I said, I hope that those people, buck up and keep us going because there's a way to handle this that we did not handle the last time we did it.
Mm. And Ellen also hosted right after Katrina, right? Wasn't there an Emmy?
It might have been. I think that she
in 2005.
was kind of our disaster go-to.
Yeah, and she addressed it from the stage to remember the victims.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's very good at that.
Yeah.
Very empathetic.
Yeah. I mean, there's some things you just can't ignore, so you have to address. Do you have anything to do with the memoriam segment?
No. The only thing I have to do with the in memoriam is take the calls from people who are weeping over the phone that Uncle Joe, if he doesn't get in the memoriam, Aunt Sally is going to freak. And it has become such a kind of status symbol to be included on the in memoriam, and like that joke with John and his Emmy being the only true measure of a person's worth. It's sort of like when you die and you don't get on the Emmy Awards or the Oscar in memoriam, that something fundamentally is wrong with your career or with you. And you got this much time and you got this much death, and it's kind of like putting 10 pounds of death in a 5-pound coffin.
What are some other are there other memorable moments for you from the Primetime Awards? I know you had one fun incident with the ticket.
Well, the situation I think that you're referring to was at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium. It was a Hill Street Blues win for Betty Thomas. And as will happen in those large groups, very emotional large groups, they will start hugging anybody who is in 5 feet of them. And the hugs and the turns and the slap on the back and starting toward the aisle and then more hugs and whatever. So if you're an imposter like Barry Bremen, who kind of did this for fun over lots of venues, you're sitting there in this really pretty good single seat down in the house. How did Barry Bremen get that really good single? I'm mea culpa. I always felt so badly about that. He came to my office at Pasadena Civic, and he said, I'm a friend of, I think he said Dick Schaff, somebody out of Detroit. And when I was living in Bowling Green, I always used to listen to the Detroit news. Detroit had the most wonderful newscasts. It was just a great news town. And so I thought, Detroit, this guy is associated with somebody who is big in network sports and whatever. I do have a single. In the Pasadena Civic, you would have odd rows. So you would see pair, and then you'd have a single down on the end. So there was a single down on the end, which you could get out of very quickly and get to the stage very quickly, which in fact he did, and accepted. Betty isn't here tonight. I'm accepting on her behalf. And then he says something to somebody. He goes backstage, and the producer grabs him, and he says, I know there's something wrong with this. And I was over in my office in the adjacent building, and they went to a commercial, came back, and then Betty got to say thanks a lot. And
so she was there.
She was there. She was just hugging people. And I always point this out. Don't let this happen to you like it happened to Betty Thomas. When your name is called, get to the stage. And I remember sitting there. We had our Emmy acceptance table out there, and about 4 Pasadena cops come trundling this guy through the lobby, and they got his hands tied behind him and had cuffs or something they took off. I don't know if they took him downtown and beat him with a rubber hose or what you do with people like that, but I doubt that it was a grand larceny. It was just kind of a crappy larceny.
You've talked a lot about the import of the award, but what distinguishes Emmy from the other luminous awards, the Oscar, the Grammy?
Well, I think that you have to recognize the context in which the Emmy is given, and it is given in a popular culture context, and it's not a smaller popular culture, say, for example, like motion pictures, which is pretty small group of films that come out, but a vast popular culture context. When you have something like that, you rely upon your award for many different things, but also to separate and to define that which is exceptional from that which is ordinary. And that seems to me to be not only the way it functions, but also as a responsibility to the culture. You go to the bookstore and you want your grandniece to have a nice book. She's going to be 4 years old, and I'm looking through. Oh, here's an Endicott label for the children's or Whitbread or whatever it might be. Sticker on the front of the book. Mm-hmm. If they're giving this book about Jimmy and his giraffe, this little thing, I've got a feeling that this probably indicates that it's something of quality, and that when I give it to my little niece, she's going to be happy with it, and her parents will be happy with it, and everything will be okay because it's got an imprimatur of quality, that it has been through some sort of cultural sorting process, and it comes out as something which has been distinguished from the ordinary and has established itself through that recognition, through that imprimatur, as something that is extraordinary. And I think that that is a very valid service that the Emmy and other awards, Peabody, of course, and other awards give. But I would say that in terms of the larger part, back to the symbolism of the Emmy, she's not standing on L.A. County. She's standing on a Mercator grid of the world, and that's the responsibility that she holds. It's something that is very widespread and international and important because there's so much, and she is saying here's a way to discern really quality stuff within that. Not to discount anything, but just simply to say this is what the peers within this particular industry who know what they're talking about, back to the original split between the two academies, that the art director said these awards are going to be a lot more valuable if they are given by people who actually know what good art direction is. Mm-hmm. The station manager down in Miami knows a lot about what good programming is, but this is a particular thing. This is the way you have scenery, this is the way you have depth, this is the way you have whatever you're doing with the lighting to make this beautiful scenery and beautiful production design. And we know what that is. And that elevates and exalts the award into a rarefied ether of quality, and the culture depends upon it.
Mm. Well, with all of that, why is it so important that an award such as this is properly administered, calendared, judged, all the things that go into your job? Why is that so important?
The single most important and valuable asset of the Television Academy is the integrity of the Emmy. And I don't care how much money you got in the bank. I don't care, how many members you have and what your membership dues are and how many seminars you hold for television professionals. The single most valuable asset is the integrity of the Emmy. If you have doubt about the integrity of the Emmy, then you've got a problem with lots of things. Case in point, that situation that we had with the challenge to two of our supporting players in long form, where they didn't have the requisite 5% on camera time. And the fact of the matter is that had that been announced as true, that we had made that mistake, you would have lost two very significant nominations. People would have been very disappointed, and there would have been a general sense, or a nagging sense, a niggling sense that, well, these guys are kind of sloppy over there, and maybe they, get things right, maybe they don't get things right. The situation with the Peter McNichol was very upsetting, very devastating, but it was such an outlier that we would have him on screen in a TV monitor, back in the background in a room. I think everybody understood. Peter McNichol certainly did understand it, because I called him up and told him what was going on with that. He said, I get it. He said, nobody did anything trying to get around anything. It was just sort of like, huh, really? I said, yeah, the huh really is what we're dealing with here. So the administration of the Emmys generally comes down to dealing with substantive issues and dealing with housekeeping issues. Housekeeping issues, you can let the little things go. Substantive issues, you can't. When we get into discussions at the both the board meeting and at the awards committee, it is incumbent upon the leadership of that group, namely the awards department people, to say we have now come to an integrity of the competition issue. This is what we're dealing with here. And this goes above and beyond where we're normally just looking at eligibility issues. This is and it's got that tag. This is the phrase that's always repeated. This is an integrity of the competition issue, and we have to deal with it this way. And if we don't deal with it properly, then we're going to tarnish or diminish the great asset of the Academy.
What's the last one that came up that was that kind of an issue? Oh,
Can we just move the phones?
the phone. Oh, sorry, John.
Sorry.
Is there, what's the one of the last issues that came up that would have dealt a blow to the integrity of the award?
Well, it was that one that with
Mm-hmm.
with the one this year,
Mm-hmm.
where they were attempting to knock out. This was a situation in which, I'm not going to name names, but this was a network person who had a couple contenders for this particular category. If we had killed those two nominations, the accountants would have brought up the next two vote getters, and it very well might have been something. I considered this to be a very treacherous and low down, disgraceful attempt, because after I explained it to the person then went to numerous trades, and it went on and on and on, and the story would never die because the person kept trying to prime the pump that there was something wrong. It was not a particularly suitable behavior to a decent person.
How do you balance between adhering to the structure and the rules as written and allowing flexibility for obvious changes in the industry that you have to have some wiggle room with? How do you address that balance yourself?
Well, I think that you always have to recognize that you've got you've got the substantive matters here, you've got all of your different categories, and then you have interstitial matters that come between them. And it is in the margins, in the interstices, that we come up with change. Change doesn't come out of the mainstream. Change comes from all of that nibbling around, where we will have, for example, new kinds of camera systems in which you need two people actually to operate the camera system. And the eligibility question then comes up, why should you just have the one person? Because they're a team, you should have both in eligibility. This is something that's kind of nibbling and coming up and percolating up. A lot of it has to do with changes in technology. A lot of it has to do with different kinds of programming types. You will have, with a show like The Amazing Race, a very distinctly different kind of recording of that show, both audio and visual, which means that you have different kinds of teams, especially when you have 5 or 6 different contestant pods that you're having to follow all the way through. And when you have something like that, you're going to have 20 sound mixers, because they're running these editors and whatever 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, running all this material through. So you have to be aware of the fact that the industry is ever evolving, that technology is changing, and sometimes, as with the rule of 14, you breathe in and you consolidate a couple categories like miniseries and movies, and sometimes you breathe out where you need to split reality between structured and unstructured reality. I think that it's a situation in which you have to take very seriously the pledge that every year there will be a thorough review of the rules and procedures, the categories of the Emmy Awards. It very well might be that you will see patterns in which where you have a mixed group, kind of apples and oranges someplace, one is dominating the other. If you have something like that, you very well might want to track it. That is, of the 5 nominations, we're going to give 2 to multicam, and we're going to give 3 depending on how many entries come in. And you have to make all of those little adjustments and calibrate and fine-tune it. Years ago on Saturday Night Live, they had, it was during the Carter administration, and Carter was known as a real, kind of geeky guy when it came to technical things. And I think it was Dan Aykroyd who was playing Jimmy Carter, and somebody it was a call-in show. And he worked for the post office, and he wasn't sure about the weight machine, the scale. And he said, well, now, if you reach back behind, you can feel that little knob. If you turn it a quarter turn to the left, okay. And yeah, that really works. And it's sort of the way you got to be.
This was your 39th Emmy?
Yes, my 39th Emmy.
So you've now worked on more more than half of the Emmys that have aired.
That is correct. I came in on number 32, and we're
71, yes.
Yeah.
So what has changed the most in your tenure about the show?
I would say that in terms of the Academy, what I had mentioned earlier, that we have changed from a sleepy little nonprofit with the ethos and sensibility of a sleepy little nonprofit to a very significant industry-wide import kind of organization representing a lot more interests and a lot more concerns than we had when we were broken off, that little piece broken off from the old Natus. Internally, that has been a change. Externally, we have been able to recognize and keep track with. I mean, what would the Emmys be if we hadn't figured out the basic equation of it's not just homes penetrated but entered, but it's homes passed? With that single change, we got cable and we got broadcast. What would we be without cable and broadcast if we had been unable to recognize that this is a legitimate form of national programming, that we simply do not have the definition that can accommodate it. So let's make one, and we did. I mean, that would have been the end of the Emmy Awards. It was the end of the Cable Ace Awards when they had, like toward the end of Animal House, where the parade band makes a left turn and then another left turn, and they walk into the brick wall down in the alley, and they get no place, and they just keep marching. That would have been us. Just keep bumping into that wall with ABC, NBC, CBS, syndication, and PBS, because everybody else would have been, I don't know, at the Paley Center, or whoever, George Schlatter would cook something up, or somebody would cook something up to accommodate, all of that. When we got into the situation with Natus, in which they were, attempting to make an internet streaming raid on the legacy genres of prime time. If we hadn't recognized that, and if we hadn't fought that, and even gone to the mat in a very expensive and difficult arbitration, where would we be? There is no reason to believe that human evolution or any other kind of evolution stops with us. It's always a work in progress, and I think that the Emmys and this organization always has to recognize that. One of the things I said earlier about the interviews is that the Academy really needs to understand what they've got here. I think that it is incumbent upon the leadership of the Academy, not just the foundation, but the Academy, and here I'm talking about the Board of Governors, to properly recognize that this is a case of an extraordinary value, that the scholars are going to be referencing these interviews for 100 years. It is absolutely a national treasure that this Academy has not only thought of, but engendered and definitely supported as much as it could. You look at the technical advances that have been made in the handling of all of this stuff, the the sensitivity to areas that need to be discussed. I mean, this discussion that we're having right now, things that I am saying are going to be accessed by some PhD candidate somewhere along the line when they want to talk about what was the nature of bringing in cable and streaming.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell you that the only other person who really understands that is Dixon Dern. And, Dixon was part of that whole thing. John Moffat, who lives down in Florida, I guess knows. But in terms of the Academy people who made it, Dixon and I are really the only one who would be able to sit here and tell you why that happened. And is there anything in the 71 years of the Emmys more important than the expansion of eligibility to include cable and streaming? And that's here. And it wouldn't be here. And when I'm gone and when Dixon's gone, people will look back and say, what happened?
Indeed, and thank you for the endorsement, but it is important, and I'm really glad that you've talked to us at such length today about this. I want to talk about just briefly your responsibilities and how they've changed. You've started as awards director, then vice president, then senior vice president. How have your responsibilities and role changed within the Academy?
I would say that my responsibilities are very much tied to the technical support and work that we do within the Academy. I'll give you an example. When I started at the Academy, we didn't have a computer. And somebody said, well, go to Radio Shack. I think they got some, like little computers there. So we went to Radio Shack, and somebody from Radio Shack came over, and we said, well, can you do this? Like, can you alphabetize all of the entries? No, that didn't work out. So we then got a Wang mainframe computer. I don't know if you remember what those things are. It's kind of like a refrigerator in a hotel. And it was on wheels, and that was the beginning of our data processing. At that particular stage of the game, I had a guy who was working for me by the name of Ray Moldauer. His aunt was Diane Moldauer, and he was living in the East, and he came out to work at the Academy one summer, and he worked in the awards department, and he stayed on. And at a particular point, I went to my boss, Jim Loper, and I said, Ray is a really good technical guy. I said, we need to have a new department. We need to have an IT department, and I think that you should hire Ray. I hate to lose him, but I think you should. Ray worked in maybe 10, 15 years in the Academy and increased and made, the technical changes. We have a lot of financial and other support for our technicals, for all of the streaming, Jenny and you, Jenny, and everybody who works on those things. So I would say that this has been a tide that has raised all of the ships. And ironically, to a certain degree, the amount of responsibility that I carry as a burden has been shifted over to more technical AI, automatic kinds of things. For example, when I first started out, I was in charge of proofing all of the ballots by hand. And if we had an entry, let's say in lead actor and in supporting actor, the same person, which was possibility, we still have multiple entries made that are illegal like that. I very well might not see it because I didn't have a computer that would give me the whole big picture of what was going on. So I don't have to do that anymore, and it gets done. It used to be, before we had the kind of technicals that we have now, that every time you would touch a piece of information, it was in jeopardy of being somehow sullied. We would start with the entries, and then we would take the entries and we would go from the entries to the nominations. As we moved manually from entries to nominations, things would get dropped out, names would be spelled wrong, etc. Now, because it's this one thing that then just gets thinned out to become the next thing, which then gets thinned out again to become the winner listing, you have one thing going all the way through as opposed to three things going all the way through, or three things individually happening. I was the one who had to take care of all three. Now I just do the one, and then the other two take care of itself because the way the technicals have done. So it's a situation in which I think things have gotten better and better and better, because of the technical support that I think, especially within the era of Bruce Rosenblum, with Lucy, definitely with Maury and the people that he has brought in, that we get better and better simply because we have better and better support in the awards department.
I want to touch on your book, and the winner is. You reference some of your mentors and colleagues who've advised you over the years, and I just want to mention a few of them by name. And you've already mentioned Tricia. Just what kind of an impact they had on you, Tricia McLeod Robin.
Yes. Well, Tricia was the secretary to the executive director at the time of the split. And the executive director went someplace, and then she became the executive director. And it was Tricia who, along with Richard Crafser, who was her awards director, who hired me. I was not considered to be a real primo candidate because I had not been engaged in nonprofit work. I was an academic. I'd come out of Cal State Long Beach. And I think they kind of felt sorry for me. I think that they sort of saw that I was sort of an orphan in the storm, and that I had had kind of an unhappy history in California in terms of employment, promises made, promises betrayed, things beyond my capacity. And I think Richard especially sort of felt that, here's this guy, and he's got this little kid, and he came out to California and things aren't working out for him, and maybe he would be okay after all. So I think that I was very fortunate to have two very empathetic people in Tricia and Crafser, and I have appreciated their indulgences forever.
Dr. James Loper.
Dr. James Loper was, I think, yes, definitely the longest running executive director of the Academy. There was a prior relationship through USC between Hank Rieger and Jim Loper. Hank Rieger was the president of the Academy. Larry Stewart then became, and then Hank Rieger came back in, and he was friends with Jim Loper. And effectively, when Hank, he got Jim Loper in the executive job, then Hank was working for the 1984 Olympic thing, and then he lost his job there, and then Jim Loper said, well, Hank, why don't you come over and you can be the editor of Emmy Magazine. So Dick Crafser went out, and Hank Rieger came in, and from that particular position, he and Jim Loper were essentially the kingmakers, the political, the Oz, the wizard behind the curtain of politics, all the way up to the point where they lost their first political election, which was when Merle Marshall won her election, beat John Agolia, who was their guy. And at that particular stage of the game, things changed enormously. I've already noted how Merle changed the whole relationship of the creative arts to the Emmy Awards, and she came in, and that was a huge change, which never would have happened had she not won that election. So I think Jim was in for about 19 years, but he was really kind of in tandem with Hank, and I think that if there was a wizard behind the curtain, it was more Hank than Jim.
You've mentioned Dixon Dern already, but talk about his impact on
Well, Dixon Dern was, when Dixon, when I came in, Dixon was our attorney, and he had a young graduate just out of UCLA Law named Bruce Rosenblum. And I would talk to Bruce all the time on the phone. He'd just been hired, and Dixon would say, well, call Leverence. He'll tell you what's going on with this. So I would talk to Bruce. So I've known Bruce for all of those years. But I think that it was Dixon who taught me the lawyerly approach to dealing with the Emmy Awards. And the lawyerly approach was basically always look for precedents. If you can find a precedent, great. If you can start with a grain of a precedent, if you can expand it out, that's fine. This is one of the reasons why we now have the situation where we have these dozen or so paradigms for making substantive rules changes, is that you have to look into that history as represented by the 12 commandments as to something which is going to be a viable defense of your request for a change. And I think that Dixon taught me how to do that, and I think that it served me and it served the Academy very well, because I would never go to anybody, the awards committee or any of the committees or whatever, and ask for substantive change unless I could say this is precedential, or if I would say this is not precedential. This is something which is absolutely brand new. It's reinventing the wheel, and you have to consider it from that different perspective. And so Dixon, I think, taught me that kind of
discipline.
Yes or no. Yeah, the kind of legal rigor.
George Sunga.
George Sunga was a long-time chair of the awards committee. He was not only a lovely, affable, brilliantly analytical guy, but he was also a unit production manager. And unit production managers know how to get stuff done. If you needed to have a dugout on the lot over at Radford, he would get the backhoe, they would dig it out, he would get the concrete truck, they would put in the dugout for your show about a baseball. George was a person who was emotionally and intellectually so suited for that kind of high-stress, very difficult job. And it's tough being the chair of the awards committee because you have to say no to a lot of people. When you have something like the Emmy Awards and you start out with 5,000 entries and you wind up with 50 winners or whatever it might be, you're just constantly saying no to people all the way down the line. When you go from the entries, this great big thing, down to the nominations, it's like you've said to an awful lot of really important people, sorry, you didn't make the cut. These are not people who are used to people telling them that they didn't make the cut, that they didn't come through. And when you have that kind of thing happen, people start asking, not what's wrong with me, what's wrong with my show, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you the way you're administering this? Did you get the right judges in there? Who were the judges that you brought in? Were they people who have any idea what kind of quality stuff that I and my colleagues who didn't make it through? That's what George has to deal with. That's what your awards chair has to deal with and the awards department has to deal with.
Louise Danton.
Louise Danton was a long-time employee in the awards department. She was in charge in the department. Each person has different ballots that they take care of. Julie takes care of the program ballot. Sherry takes care of the performer ballot. Louise had the unfortunate draw to take care of some of the most difficult ballots. The costume design ballot is probably one of the most difficult. There are terrible, terrible disputes in costume design about eligibility. You will find, it seems weird, but you will find that they will hire a team to come in on a pilot, back when we used to have pilots, and then they'll fire them. And then they'll bring in another team because they don't like the look. Well, then now we come to, the team for eligibility. Well, am I in or am I out? Well, you were fired. You weren't part of it, and you need a certain percentage of shows. Well, but I did the pilot, which is separate from it. Louise had to deal with that, and she was enormously patient and a good diplomat. It took a lot of that to get through that ballot.
Barbara Chase.
Barbara Chase, again, worked for the awards department for years. She was a daytime administrator, and nobody better at detail than Barbara, which it took an awful lot to take care of that. Again, the daytime situation was always prickly. It's much better now, but it was always prickly, and Barbara was just wonderful with that.
And Julie Shore.
Julie Shore is going to be with the awards department working for me. I hired her. This is her 31st year, I think, that she's been in. She came in working for the membership department, and I stole her away from the membership department, and she has moved into a position of vice president, and I told Maury and I told Lucy before Maury that I said, I have been notified by every executive director that I have worked with over the years that it's time for me to start looking for a successor, and maybe you need to bring some guys in to talk. I said, I'm not bringing any guys in to talk to them. I said, Julie is the successor. I've been telling people that Julie is the successor for 25 years. And, she has never done anything but absolutely confirm my confidence in her. And I feel so good leaving the awards department in such good hands and with such wonderful people with, lines of succession that I can see from Julie down through other members of the department. And it's one of those things, getting back to the idea of having to establish precedents, that if you haven't been there for a long, it takes you 5 years to just sort of figure out what's going on. And to have people like Julie, over 30 years, Sherry, 20, 25 years, Barry Nedler before she shifted over to another department, but people who've been the 10, I don't think I have anybody in the department who hasn't worked there for, at least 5, and most of them 10, 15, 20, 30 years. So I've been very blessed by having such a faithful group of people, people who like good lawyers, understand the precedent of the law, who understand from year to year that you can discuss in a very shorthand way complex problems because we all can reference that. You remember this? Oh, yeah, that guy, yeah, we had that problem with that guy, and we resolved it this way. That's our paradigm. We're going to resolve this one this way. Is that we can bang these things around. We can take 10 problems, and, it's like a pinball machine. It just goes around and hits this, that, and whatever, and then it comes down, and you get a win. And I don't think that the awards department would be able to function at the high level of competence that it functions at if you had a kind of typical turnover in terms of staff. You just can't have it. It doesn't work.
What has been a piece of advice you've received, either yourself or just heard about working in this industry, that you would pass on?
Let the little things go.
That's a good one.
It is a good one.
And
We
is that
really
the
do.
same? I mean, for Julie or for anyone else stepping into your shoes or taking this on at another organization, what advice would you specifically give about administering awards?
I would say that you always have to have the integrity of the Emmy as your most important product. That's what you're here for. That's at the end of the day what you're getting paid for. And the more money you get paid, the more responsibility you have to fulfill that. The Emmy Award is, I think that you understand from what I've said, is a sacred object. It's a numinous object. It means something beyond an industry award. It means something that is a kind of spiritual yang to the material yin that is our industry. And I think, as Jung pointed out, that if you don't have that wholeness, you have a broken individual, you have a broken system. And so you're constantly trying to find a way to bring about the animus in conjunction with the anima, bringing about thinking with feeling, and all of the different disparities that you have in personalities and in psychology and emotion. I think that you need people who not only have a high IQ but a high EQ. I think that people who have an emotional quotient which is diminished are somewhere on the autism spectrum, and they're not going to work out well in the awards department. There are some jobs that you really want people on the autism spectrum. I mean, that's what you need. Like a relief pitcher for the Dodgers.
Not this one.
Yeah.
You were honored with the Sid Cassett Award by the Television Academy in 2010. What did that mean to you?
Oh, it just meant the world to me. I was so shocked. The people who had come before me, founders of the Academy, Sid Cassett, I remember having received it, Bob Lewine, who I've referenced earlier, who I had the highest amount of respect for. Rich Frank was another person who had received that. And to be a staff person, see, this was completely new, that it was always kind of the old guard of the Academy, people who had been volunteers at the presidential level, and here was a little staff person who was going to receive it, and it just absolutely meant the world to me. It still does. I look at it, and I feel a sense of a real honor and fulfillment that the Board of Governors would think so highly of me to give me that precious award.
What has been your proudest career achievement?
My proudest career achievement has come to this point where I am walking away from the Academy knowing that everything is cool. I think that my department is my proudest. It's like your children. You're so proud of every one of them because each one of them has their own goodness and decency and ability. And I think that if I were leaving this department in ragtag and God knows what's going to happen, and the person who's coming up behind me I don't trust, but having all of those people, that was my greatest. They're my children, they're my mentors, and it seems to be a little bit of a contradiction to have both mentees and mentors, but that's what I've got. I'm doubly blessed.
What have you enjoyed most about administering the awards for almost 40 years? What has been the most fulfilling aspect? I
think that I've enjoyed mainly the give and take of the expansion of the awards, the dynamic of the Emmys, the interrelationship with the realities of the industry. I think my happiest time is at the time that we do our awards review, when we go through all of the rules and procedures and we weigh in the balance the different proposals, and the staff makes proposals, and that has I think been very intellectually stimulating to try to keep the ship on course and to really make a difference, to make it ever better, ever more important on an annual basis. And I must say, coming October 23rd, the Engineering Awards, I write the script for that, and it's kind of the biggest evening of the year. I just absolutely love those people, those engineers, all of whom are on the autism spectrum, believe me.
Rightly so.
Rightly so. That's part of the deal.
Are there any career regrets?
Yeah, I would say that Barry Brown ranks right up there with one of my career regrets. I think that, from time to time I have lacked the patience to, you kind of get overwhelmed. It's kind of like when I first came to the Emmys, I was talking to one of the staff people about the difference between the LA area and the Prime Time Awards. She said, well, the LA area is kind of like having a, little yippy dog. And, whereas the Prime Time, it's just like this great big old sheepdog just knocks you out of its way. And I think that sometimes when you get knocked out of the way by something as big as administering the Primetime Emmy Awards, you tend to do some things that you should have done, and do some things that you shouldn't have done. Don't do things that you should have done.
Any predictions for what might come up in the next review and for the future of the awards?
Oh, I think that it is, it tends to move kind of like the old adage that you want to go quickly but in a slow way.
Festina lente.
That's festina lente, and I think that is the that is the motto that we should all attend to, festina lente.
Final question we ask of all of our interviewees. How would you like to be remembered?
I think I would like to be remembered as a person who was Switzerland. I don't want to be remembered as Turkey or some of the other places around the world, but I would like to be thought of as Switzerland, a place where there was stability, a place where there was order, and a place where the things that were under my responsibility could thrive.
Well, John, Dr. John Leverence,
Uh-huh.
thank you for all of the years that you've dedicated to making this award so special and
You're welcome.
for the integrity you brought to it. And thanks for sitting with us
Okay,
today.
thank you.